Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we're going to start by looking at an important item description. Upper Level Key. Key that seals the upper level of the Cathedral Ward. There are two high-ranking factions in the medical church. Each one has their own base of power. The Mensis school faction in the Hidden Ward, and the Holy Song Troop in the upper level. Consequently, this key is a thing that brings one closer to the Holy Song Troop. In terms of the game's lore, this description is extremely useful, since it lays out how the Healing Church has been split up, what the various factions call themselves, and where each one is based. There are also some translation choices on display here that I'm a big fan of. But the detail I most want to focus on is actually the name of one of the church factions, the School of Mensis, because there are a number of things that the term Mensis linguistically ties into, and they're all important to the game. For one thing, it's a word that has some very old roots that tie it to the modern English word for moon. Apparently, the me in Mensis relates to the idea of measurement, like you might find in the word meter. And since the phases of the moon were used as a way of keeping time in the ancient world, the word became associated with that particular heavenly body in a number of languages. In Latin, for instance, mensis means month, and that's likely because it's referring to a single lunar interval. Meanwhile, in the Germanic languages, this same root, me, became menon, which passed into Old English as mona, and that evolved over time into the modern English moon. But there's another association with the term mensis that survived into modern English, one that's easier to see based on the plural form of the word, menses. It's a meaning that harkens back to the Latin sense of the word referring to a month, because it's evolved into a term used to describe the menstrual cycle, or the monthly discharge of blood from the uterus. This brings in not only the idea of blood, but also that of human reproduction. In other words, by calling themselves the School of Mensis, this Healing Church faction is associating themselves linguistically with the moon, with the span of a single lunar cycle, with blood, and with the reproductive process. Now, we've already learned that the School of Mensis has been performing a ritual to beckon the moon that involves some sort of newborn, but if that weren't enough to demonstrate how important these themes are not only to this particular faction, but to Bloodborne in general, we need look no further for evidence than the cutscene that's currently playing. It really drives home that connection between childbirth and the moon so brilliantly alluded to both in the Japanese and in the English by way of Latin and other linguistic roots. But while we're waiting for the cosmos to give second birth to some strange, seemingly undead creature, I want to get back to another aspect of the Upper Cathedral Key's translation that I find really well done. I think the translators have done a great job here of connecting some dots and being clear about what exactly this key is. It's an issue that actually shows up right in the name of the item, which literally is just something like key to the upper level. This, as you can imagine, is not an especially helpful name for an item. Fortunately, for anyone confused as to which upper level is being referenced here, the first line of the description clarifies that this is the key to the upper level of the Cathedral Ward. Given this context, I think it was not only helpful for the translators to be more specific about the name, but that the resulting English term sounds more natural. Also, while it's perhaps not as strong in the English as in the Japanese, linking this key specifically to the upper portion of the Cathedral Ward does help to potentially remind the player of something Alfred said a long time ago. Back when we asked him about the Healing Church, he told us in English that counselors of the old church reside in the high stratum of the Cathedral Ward. Well, that phrase, high stratum of the Cathedral Ward, is seidogai no joso in Japanese, using the same word, joso, as is used in this key. In fact, the initial line of the item description in Japanese features an almost identical phrase, seidogai joso. Clearly, we're meant to put together that this key will take us to where some of the leaders of the Healing Church reside, though now we know that the people who dwell in this place above the Cathedral Ward are but one of two high-level factions. Regardless of church politics, though, I think directly identifying this key with the Upper Cathedral Ward helps English-speaking players make this connection, even if it doesn't match up with Alfred's words quite as literally as the Japanese does. Finally, I want to briefly mention that I appreciate how the official wording for the description succinctly conveys the relevant information of the Japanese, while both changing the original sentence structure for clarity and avoiding repetitive phrasing. Anyway, before I kill this boss, let's talk about its name. Based on the 3 kanji on screen, it would translate to something like Reborn One or The Reborn. Now, I think the official translation of The One Reborn sounds more impressive, but there are arguably a couple of issues with it. For one thing, it doesn't allow for a plural understanding of the boss name, and for another, it kind of implies that maybe we should have fought the One before facing the One Reborn. Personally, I see this boss as a single entity and think the name works on its own, but I wanted to mention those considerations before moving on. Yet to be unsealed invitation. An old invitation that has yet to be unsealed. Could this be a thing inviting someone to Canehurst, the same as the first letter? No particular addressee is written down. Obviously, this is a pretty short item description, but there are still some interesting translation choices on display here. In particular, I'm a big fan of how the translators have handled what could have been quite awkward in English, namely the exact state that this letter is in. You can see this right in the item name, where the kanji in Japanese work out to not yet, open, and seal, which I've translated more literally as yet to be unsealed invitation. Clearly, this would make for quite a clunky name, but there's actually an additional level of complexity at work here. That's because even though the term kaifu literally consists of the characters for open and seal, in common usage it tends to be used for the opening of a letter more generally. Looking at the image for this item though, it's clear that the letter has in fact been closed with a wax seal, implying that not only is this an unopened letter, it's one that literally has yet to have its seal broken. Ideally then, the translators have to get across both that this summons is unopened and that its wax seal is still intact. That's a lot to convey in an item name, and indeed, the official translation of Unopened Summons only addresses some of this. Looking at the first line of the description though, the same term in the Japanese, ni kaifu, has been translated as sealed. This gets across what was missing in the item name by itself, and works as a natural-sounding way of referring to this same letter while avoiding the repetition of calling it an unopened summons again. It's another example of how changing the way information is presented can lead to a better translation. Still, there is one aspect of the Japanese I wish was better represented in the English. In the original, there's marked speculation about the contents of the letter, which only makes sense because it is, after all, unopened. In the official translation, though, it's stated unambiguously that it's an invitation to Canehurst. Now, I don't think this is a huge problem, since even in Japanese, the item name identifies it as an invitation, but I do think part of the description could have been reworded to better preserve the idea of a lack of certainty on this unopened letter's contents. But wasn't Alfred hunting Vilebloods? What does he make of this?
Aha! Is that the sigil of Canehurst? I've heard tell of Canehurst nobles and their amusingly pompous invitations. Wonderful. I thank you profusely. I will depart immediately, but first, a token of my gratitude.
Oh, you don't have to. I mean, you've helped me so much already.
Ah, I feel my master's hand at work. Praise the good blood, and let us cleanse these tarnished streets.
Yeah, like with the hunt, right?
It has been an honor, but I must say goodbye. Let us cleanse these tarnished streets, and may the good blood guide your way.
You're starting to sound a bit fanatic there, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Speaking of Alfred's zealous tone, though, I think it's worth mentioning again how well the translation captures the specifics of Alfred's character voice, especially now that he's clearly excited. He's always come across as formal but friendly in both languages, and even here, he's consistently using des mas forms in the Japanese, as well as humble and honorific forms when referencing his own efforts or his master's will, respectively. However, he's started to invert his sentences more in the original, as well as trail off more frequently, and while he's always come across as pious, this bit of dialogue also sees an increase in his use of religious phrasings. Crucially, the official English does a great job of capturing the feeling produced by these grammatical changes without literally mirroring them. Just look at the second line here for what I think is a perfect example. Even ignoring the contents of the sentence, the way it's inverted in Japanese emphasizes the less polite plain form Alfred uses when relaying information about the nobles of Canehurst. And while the translation isn't inverted in English, "I've heard tell of Canehurst nobles and their amusingly pompous invitations," is practically dripping with disdain for the practice. That phrasing, combined with the voice actor's excellent delivery, tells you a lot about what Alfred thinks of the whole situation, and in doing so, it achieves what I think the grammatical structure of the original was going for. But on top of that, this whole dialogue is also worded to be in keeping with our existing understanding of Alfred. For instance, using the phrase "I've heard tell" evokes that old-timey, somewhat bookish aspect of his speech patterns, together with phrases like "I thank you profusely" and "but first, a token of my gratitude." You really get the sense that this is Alfred you're talking to, with his unique voice. At the same time, though, it's clear he's in a heightened state of emotion, what with his intentions to depart immediately and how happy he is at having made this discovery. Couple this excitement with the religious phrasings he closes on and his clear disdain for the nobles of Canehurst, and this clearly reads as Alfred being in a kind of barely contained religious fervor. Obviously, the voice acting helps here, but I think this is a great example of good character writing in translation. Before we finish with this dialogue, though, there's one more line I want to focus on, because not only do I think it's been well translated, I also think it gets at one of the game's larger themes. The line in question is the one where Alfred says he feels his master's hand at work, and I'd like to start out by considering this as a translation. So, looking at the Japanese, the key word here is oboshimeshi. It's a term with a few different meanings, but in this case it seems clear enough that it's being used in its primary sense as an honorific way of referring to the thoughts, feelings, or intentions of another. In the full sentence, Alfred is literally speculating as to whether this too is his master's will. Now, theoretically, he could be unsure of what his master would want in this instance, but given what he's told us about searching for Canehurst Castle to honor his master's wishes, I think this interpretation is unlikely. It seems much more reasonable to me to interpret this statement as Alfred questioning whether this turn of events was not due to some plan or intention of Logarius's, and having him say he feels his master's hand at work strikes me as a natural way of getting across that same idea. I also think it emphasizes the influence the past has over the present, which is the larger theme I alluded to earlier. Logarius is dead. He'd been reduced to little more than a desiccated corpse by the time we got to Canehurst Castle, and then we slaughtered him to put an end to his enduring vigil. Yet his influence lingers on. Alfred's comment here could be taken literally, perhaps in the sense that Logarius intentionally preserved an unaddressed summons along with the Queen in the hopes that it would eventually reach one of his followers, or the comment could be seen as more abstract, an echo of Logarius' desires resounding beyond death to shape events so the summons could reach Alfred's hand. Either way, though, we're seeing how Logarius' will to bring an end to the Vile Bloods outlives him, and this is in part because it's been inherited by Alfred. It's something that I think ties in with part of what it means to be a hunter, inheritors of an ongoing legacy in a world where the past haunts the present. But that's a lot of high-level discussion over what's ultimately a pretty simple line. Why don't we bring things back down to a smaller scale by looking at another item description? Skull of the Holy One. One of the special materials necessary for a Holy Chalice ritual. A piece of the Holy Ones, sacrifices of the Healing Church made for the purpose of its exploration. The defenders of the ruins are said to have displayed an odd agitation at the death scent of the Holy Ones. By means of the additive rite death scent offering, some of the defenders will display agitation. They are more dangerous than usual, but should become the subjects of a special hunt. And if that description sounds familiar, that's because it's exactly the same as the description for the sage's wrist. This is true of both the Japanese and the official English, right down to the apparently missing line in the middle. I covered this back in Translationborne 38, and while I still agree with my previous analysis, I do have a new theory as to why this line might have been lost in the English. Once again, this is tied to the fact that both the Japanese item description and the official English item description were updated, and it was this update that introduced the discrepancy. Back in version 1.00 of the game, the English item description had all the same information as the Japanese description, only with a slightly different presentation and using the word rite instead of ritual early on. Then the Japanese text was updated, adding the entire section about the rite feated offering at the end. The official English, of course, added this same text, but instead of simply appending it to the end of the item description, it replaced the existing final section. This could have been a simple mistake, possibly because whoever updated the text thought the section being removed in English was also meant to be removed from the Japanese, or maybe because they thought only the last section of the description was being updated and didn't realize the final section of the existing English item description actually corresponded to the middle section of the Japanese description. Alternatively, it could have been an issue of character and line limitations, with the translators being forced to consolidate some of the admittedly repetitive information. Anyway, whatever the explanation, it at least makes sense to me that the Japanese text being patched after the fact would be what introduced the issue, as in my own experience as a translator, such updates are frequently made with minimal context as to how and where they're being implemented. What doesn't make as much sense to me is why the official English translation for the item name would be Sage's Hair as opposed to Sage's Skull. The original Japanese term here is zugai, also read as togai, which every definition I've been able to find identifies as the bone structure that forms a vertebrate's head. The word is even used as part of the more technical subdivisions in Japanese for the neurocranium, which contains the brain, and the viscerocranium, which gives structure to the face. In other words, the English seems to simply be using a different term. I'm not sure why this would be, unless maybe this is an instance where the official translation's been based on an outdated version of the Japanese. This doesn't seem impossible based on the image associated with the item, which features a skull with a noticeable head of hair, though of course that's far from conclusive evidence. But as perplexing as I find this discrepancy, at least it's not a point with a huge amount of significance for the game. Both hair and skulls have a history of being considered relics in Catholicism, and since these holy Catholic relics seem to be a lot of what the ritual materials are based off of, the fact that this idea has been preserved is perhaps the most important thing. Anyway, while I can't be sure of much when it comes to the translation of this item, we've certainly reached the end of the episode. As always, should you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Until next time then, thanks for watching, everyone.